"Do you know where I can sleep tonight?" That was what she asked. Not the man behind her in the lineup at the all-night pharmacy. Not the woman with the stroller who had already looked away. She asked Corbett Shade, which said something about either her desperation or her instincts. Because Corbett Shade was not a man people asked for anything, unless they had already exhausted every other option in the city. He was standing at the prescription counter in a black coat that cost more than most people's rent, waiting for medication he would never explain to anyone, when the voice came from somewhere below his left shoulder. Small, careful, trying very hard not to sound like what it was. He looked down. She was maybe 23, dark circles under her eyes that had nothing to do with a late night and everything to do with a long year. A canvas bag over one shoulder, zipper broken, held shut with a binder clip. A bruise along her jaw in the yellow stage of healing, the kind that meant it had been there a week. She was watching him the way people watched a streetlight in a blackout, not because they expected warmth, but because it was the only thing still standing. "I'm sorry," she said before he could respond. "I don't know why I asked you. I'm sorry." She turned to leave. "Wait," Corbett said. She stopped. She did not turn around right away. He noticed that. The pause of someone who had learned to brace before facing whatever came next. "There's a shelter on Burrard," he said. "They take women after 10. She turned then. Her eyes were dark brown, steady in the way eyes go steady when they have given up on flinching. "They were full. I checked 3. Corbett looked at her for a long moment. The pharmacist behind the counter was pretending to count pills. A man near the vitamins had his phone out and was looking at it too hard. "Come on," Corbett said. She did not move. I don't do that." He understood immediately. "Neither do I," he said. "There's a hotel 2 blocks over. I own it. You'll have a room with a lock and I won't have a key to it." She searched his face the way people search a contract before signing something they can't afford to be wrong about. "Why?" she asked. It was the right question. Most people didn't ask it. "Because it's February," he said. "And you're standing in a pharmacy at midnight with a broken bag." That was not the whole truth. The whole truth was older and darker and lived behind his sternum in a place he did not open for strangers. But it was enough of the truth to be useful tonight. Her name was Sable Vance. He learned that from the front desk when she filled out the registration form in handwriting that slanted slightly, like someone who had learned to write in a hurry and never had the luxury of slowing down. She took the key card without looking at him. Rode the elevator without speaking. When the doors closed, he stood in the lobby and watched the numbers climb. He went home. He did not sleep. In the morning, he told Bridget, his hotel manager, to let the room run another night. Then another. He told himself it was administrative convenience. He was not a man who examined his own motivations at close range if he could avoid it. On the 3rd day, Bridget called him. "Your guest is in the kitchen with Marco." "Why?" She asked if she could help. "She's been peeling carrots for an hour. Marco says she's fast." Corbett was silent for a moment. Let her. By the end of the week, Sable Vance had become a fixture in the hotel kitchen from 6 in the morning until the lunch service ended. She did not ask for payment. She did not ask for anything. She showed up and she worked, and she made herself as small as possible in the space between tasks, which was the thing that caught Corbett's attention, the way a wrong note catches a musician's ear. People who took up careful amounts of space had been taught to. He came into the kitchen on a Thursday. She was at the prep counter slicing parsnips with a focus that had nothing casual in it. Marco was explaining something about stock reduction. She was nodding with the specific attention of someone who has learned that paying attention is one of the only currencies available to people without other resources. She looked up when Corbett walked in. Not the flinch exactly, but the neighbor of it, the preparation. "You don't have to work for the room," he said. Her jaw tightened. "I'm not working for the room. I'm working because I needed something to do." He leaned against the counter. Marco tactfully became very interested in a pot on the far stove. Sable. He used her name for the first time. It landed oddly, like something retrieved from a drawer it had been stored in for a while. "Sit down for a minute." She put the knife down with the blade away from the edge, the way someone trained in kitchens does automatically. Then she sat on the metal stool near the pass-through and looked at him with those steady, careful eyes. "How long has it been?" he asked. She knew what he meant. 8 days since I left. Where did you go before the pharmacy? My car." A pause. "Before that, my sister's couch. Before that, the apartment." She said it flatly, not performing anything. He decided I owed him 2 months of back rent and a new television. Corbett kept his voice even. "He, my landlord." She looked at her hands. "Who was also?" She stopped. "It doesn't matter what else he was, it mattered." Corbett did not say so. "Are you safe?" he asked instead. She looked up at him with the faint, exasperated patience of a woman who had heard that question from people who were not actually prepared for the answer. For now. Good, he stood. The room is yours, not as payment for anything, just yours. Until you have somewhere else. She stared at him. You don't know me. No, so why? Sable. He moved toward the kitchen door. You peeled carrots for an hour before anyone noticed you were there. Whatever the reason you're here, you're not a person who takes things she doesn't mean to earn. I'm not worried about the room. He left before she could answer. He had learned a long time ago that some things landed better when you walked away from them before they could be argued with. His name in certain rooms in Vancouver was Shade, just the last name, and what it meant depended on which room you were in. In the rooms where money moved before dawn and no one asked where it came from, Shade meant a man you did not cross. In the rooms where city council members ate lunch and developers finalized agreements that would reshape waterfront blocks, Shade meant a man who showed up twice a year and left with outcomes that had seemed impossible before he arrived. In the kitchen of the Aldgate Hotel at 6 in the morning, apparently, it meant a man who offered rooms to women with broken bag zippers and careful eyes, which was a reputation Corbett had not intended to build and did not quite know what to do with. His head of security was a man named Theron Bolt. Theron had a face like quarried stone and a voice that came out of him so rarely it startled people when it did. He appeared in Corbett's office on the 4th day after Sable's arrival and stood in the doorway with the stillness of someone reporting information he was not sure how to categorize. She's clean, he said. No warrants, no flags. She had a registered address in East Van until 3 weeks ago. Social insurance number checks out. She worked at a restaurant supply company for 2 years, then 6 months at a kitchen on Granville. He paused. Her former landlord has 2 complaints filed against him. Neither went anywhere. Corbett looked up from the papers on his desk. Her former landlord? Yes, name. Theron placed a single sheet on the desk. Corbett looked at it for a moment. He knew the name. He knew the building, too. He knew the kind of man who filed paperwork for back rent the day after something else had happened and called it accounting. That's all, Corbett said. Theron left without another word. He understood the tone. Sable did not know she had become the quiet center of the Aldgate's morning operations until the morning she came in, and Roz, the front desk supervisor, had saved her a coffee from the staff room without being asked. Or until Desmond, the night porter, started finishing his shift 20 minutes late because she came in at 6. And he had apparently decided he needed to tell her about the delivery situation before he went home. Or until Marco began explaining things to her that he did not need to explain at lengths that were not strictly professional. Because she asked good questions and listened the way good cooks listen, with their whole body turned toward the information. Corbett watched all of it from a careful distance. He told himself he was watching for problems. He was watching for other things. She was precise in the kitchen, not technically trained but practically sharp, the kind of person who had learned from doing rather than from instruction, and had somewhere along the way developed a philosophy of waste that bordered on religious. She used every part of everything. She tasted before she seasoned. She cleaned as she moved without being asked. She also, when she thought no one was looking, wrapped leftover rolls in a side towel before the bread basket was cleared, and slipped the bundle into the canvas bag she kept on the hook by the freezer. Not greed, not malice, the reflex of someone for whom food had not always been reliably there. Corbett saw it the first time and said nothing. He told Marco quietly to make sure the staff meal, before service, was substantial. Marco asked no questions. He told himself that was the end of it. That was not the end of it. On the 11th day, he was reviewing lease agreements in his office when his phone rang. It was Theron, 2 words. She's gone. Corbett was in the elevator before he'd finished processing the sentence. Theron met him in the lobby. His expression was contained in the way faces go contained when the information inside them is bad. Front camera picked up a man in the alley entrance at 5:40 this morning. He was there when she arrived at 6. He followed her from the side door to the kitchen entrance. Theron pulled out his phone and showed the footage. A man in a gray jacket, unhurried, patient in the way of people who believe they have already won. She saw him through the window. She went out the back. Which direction? South, toward the water. Corbett looked at Theron. Theron had already put his coat on. They found her 40 minutes later at a bus shelter on Cordova, sitting with her bag on her knees and her hands folded on top of it, watching the street with eyes that had gone flat and closed, the windows you pull the blinds on when you stop expecting the view to change. Corbett sat down beside her. He didn't say anything at first. The rain was coming off the harbor in thin gray curtains. Somewhere down the block a truck shifted gears. "He found you," he said eventually. "He always does." She said it without drama. It was the worst kind of statement, the kind that meant this was not the first time, and her body had already adjusted to the frequency. "Did he see where you went after?" "I don't think so." She paused. "I'll find somewhere else tonight. I'm sorry about the room, Sable." She didn't look at him. "Look at me." She turned. Her face was composed in the way faces compose themselves when composure is the last available resource. "You're not sorry about the room," he said, "and you don't need to find somewhere else. Come back. He knows where I am now." "No," Corbett said. "He knows where you were. Those are different things." She searched him. Rain tapped the shelter roof. Theron stood at the edge of the bus shelter with his hands behind his back, watching the street with the expression of a man who had decided the problem was already manageable. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked. Corbett looked at the harbor for a moment. The water was gray under the low sky, the mountains across the inlet swallowed entirely by cloud. Vancouver in February was the city at its most honest, all the summer beauty stripped away, and what was left was just the bones of the place, the water and the stone and the rain that never fully stopped. He thought about saying something practical. He was good at practical. He had built his entire adult life on practical. "Because you asked the right question in the pharmacy," he said instead. "Most people don't." She did not understand what he meant. That was fine. He was not sure he understood it either. Not yet. She came back. The man's name was Gallo. Not a first name or a last name. Just Gallo, which was either a nickname or an affectation, and Corbett did not particularly care which. He had owned 3 rental properties in East Vancouver for 6 years, and had a way of resolving lease disputes that relied heavily on the absence of witnesses, and the particular vulnerability of tenants who could not afford lawyers. Corbett learned this the same way he learned most things that mattered, by asking 2 questions instead of 1, and listening to what people said in the space between their answers. He did not go to find Gallo. He let Gallo come to him. It took 4 days. Gallo appeared at the Aldgate front desk on a Tuesday afternoon, wearing the kind of confident expression that men wear when they've convinced themselves that persistence is the same thing as right. He asked for a guest by name. Roz smiled at him with the professional warmth of someone who had handled far worse, and told him there was no guest registered under that name. He leaned on the counter. Roz's smile did not waver. Corbett was watching on the lobby camera from his office. He came down himself. Gallo saw him cross the lobby and recalibrated his expression into something more manageable. He put out a hand. "I'm looking for someone who may be staying here. I'm her." "I know what you are," Corbett said. Gallo blinked. His hand came down. Corbett stopped in front of him. He did not raise his voice. He had learned when he was 19 years old that the men who raised their voices were the men who still believed volume was power. He was not that kind of man anymore. "There's no one here connected to you," Corbett said. "That won't change." Gallo's jaw tightened. "She has a financial obligation. She doesn't." Corbett reached into his coat pocket and removed an envelope. He handed it to Gallo, who opened it with the unsteady fingers of a man who has walked into a situation he misestimated. Inside was a 1-page document, notarized. "That's her confirmation that no rent was outstanding at the time of her departure. It's also a summary of 2 complaints filed against you in 2021 and 2022, and a statement from a woman in New Westminster who has agreed to speak on record." He paused. "You'll want to have someone read the 2nd page carefully." Gallo looked up from the papers. Something in his expression had changed. The confidence had not disappeared exactly. It had cracked around the edges, the way ice cracks before it gives way. "You have no idea what you're getting into." Corbett looked at him the way he looked at city councilors who tried to renegotiate terms on the morning of the signing. "I know exactly what I'm in. The question is whether you understand what you're standing in the middle of." Gallo looked at the lobby, at Theron visible near the far wall, at the camera above the desk whose angle he had not thought to calculate. He folded the papers, put them in his jacket. "She's not worth this," he said. "Walk out of here," Corbett said, "and don't come back." Gallo left. He walked too quickly, which was the detail Corbett noted. The walk of a man who still believed he could look like he chose to leave. Theron appeared at Corbett's shoulder. "You want eyes on him?" "Yes, 48 hours. After that, he'll make a decision one way or the other." He made it in 36. Corbett received confirmation at 7 in the morning. Gallo had pulled his camera equipment from the alley behind the Aldgate, the kind of decision a man makes when he's done the arithmetic on his own exposure. Corbett was in the hotel kitchen when he heard. Sable was at the prep counter making stock from the bones Marco had left overnight. She had her hair tied back and flour on one sleeve from something earlier, and she was entirely absorbed in the task in the way she always was, her whole body organized around the work. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "He's gone," Corbett said. She looked up. "Set down the ladle." "For good?" she asked. "I think so." "Yes." She held very still. People who have been running tend to go still when told to stop, as if the body needs a moment to believe the ground is solid before it agrees to stand on it. "What did you do?" she asked. Nothing he could object to. He crossed to the coffee station and poured himself a cup. He had 2 complaints sitting in a drawer somewhere that never went anywhere, because no one had organized them into the shape they needed to be in. They're organized now. Sable looked at him for a long time. "You didn't have to do that, I know. I could have. I was going to handle it eventually." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "I know that too." Her expression moved through something complicated. He had seen that expression before on people who had spent a long time managing everything alone and had developed a particular relationship with help that made receiving it feel like a concession. "Sable," he set the cup down. "I didn't do it to make you owe me something. I did it because it needed doing and I had the means to do it faster than you did. That's all." She looked down at the stockpot at the gray morning rising over the alley window at her own hands, the flower on her sleeve. "Thank you," she said quietly. He nodded once and left her to the stock. She did not leave after that. He had half expected her to, on the logic that some people, once the immediate danger passed, needed to put distance between themselves and the place that had witnessed their worst week. He understood that instinct. He had operated on it himself at 22 when he had walked out of a neighborhood that had held every difficult thing he'd ever survived and told himself he was going forward, not away. He had been wrong, mostly. Going forward and going away turned out to be the same direction for longer than he'd expected. Sable stayed. She took on more hours in the kitchen, still not formally employed, which began to make Marco quietly insane because he had a preference for things being on paper, and Corbett's arrangement with her existed entirely in the space between official and personal, which was where most of Corbett's arrangements lived. In the 3rd week, Theron appeared in the office doorway again. "She asked Marco if she could speak to you," he said. Corbett looked up. "Send her in." She appeared 5 minutes later. She had washed the kitchen off her hands and changed her shirt, which for reasons Corbett did not examine closely struck him as something. She sat in the chair across his desk without waiting to be asked, which was different from the 1st week, and he noticed the difference. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Go ahead." "Why does someone in your position—" She paused, recalibrated. "What is your position exactly?" "Because Marco says one thing and Roz says something else, and the man who came to fix the elevator called you the landlord of half the block, which doesn't seem quite right." Corbett leaned back. "What did Marco say?" "That you're the most reasonable person he's ever worked for, and that this would surprise most people who know your name." Something shifted in his expression. "That's a generous read. What's the less generous one?" He was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who explained himself easily. He had built his adult life, the second version of it, on the premise that explanations invited negotiations, and negotiations were for people who weren't certain of their position. He was always certain of his position. Uncertainty had been something that happened to him before, and he had taken considerable trouble to ensure it didn't happen again. "I own property," he said carefully. "Some of it is straightforward, some of it is not. I have interests in businesses that operate in a particular part of the city's economy that is not always visible to the part of the economy that files taxes in the conventional way." Sable looked at him. "So the less generous read is accurate. Depends on your definition of generous. Does it make people afraid of you?" "Yes. Are you the kind of person I should be afraid of?" He held her gaze. "I'm the kind of person who should be on a very short list of people who scare you, and should also be on a completely different list of people you can rely on. And those 2 lists don't usually overlap, which is why you should think carefully before deciding which one to put me on." She thought about that. She had a way of thinking about things quietly, without filling the space with sound, that he was beginning to recognize as one of her specific features. "Both," she said finally. "What? I'll put you on both." She stood. "I think that's the honest answer." He watched her leave. For a moment the office felt oddly quiet. He turned back to the contracts on his desk and read the same clause 4 times without absorbing a word of it. 6 weeks after the pharmacy, the city outside had begun its reluctant negotiation with spring, rain instead of sleet, the mountains across the inlet visible some mornings before the clouds closed back in. Sable had a formal employment contract now under Marco's kitchen staff, which made Marco's paperwork instincts happy and made Sable uncomfortable in the specific way of someone who was not used to being made legitimate. She read the contract twice, signed it with the careful hand of someone for whom signatures had occasionally been used against them, and gave it back to Corbett without comment. He was learning her in pieces, not aggressively, not by asking. The way you learn a city, by walking it, accumulating details without trying to catalog them. She drank her coffee with no sugar and too much of it. She read on her lunch break, always, dog-earing pages with a seriousness that suggested the books had earned the damage. She never sat with her back to a door in a room with more than 3 people in it. She said thank you in the specific way of people who were taught that gratitude was currency and had learned to spend it carefully. He also learned. She had a younger brother somewhere in Ontario who she called on Thursday evenings and spoke to in a low voice from the hotel stairwell, laughing quietly at things that sounded like old references, like a shorthand built over years. She had studied 1 year of culinary arts before the money ran out. She had a scar on her left forearm from a kitchen accident she described in 3 words and dismissed. She trusted Marco before she trusted anyone else in the building, which told him something about the kind of people she'd historically been able to rely on. Practical people. People who showed up. The complication, which Corbett had been successfully not thinking about for 6 weeks, was that he had begun looking for reasons to be in the kitchen in the morning. He was not a man who did things without reasons. He had built his entire structure, the properties, the relationships, the network of obligations and arrangements that constituted his place in the city, on deliberate action, on knowing exactly what he was doing and why, on never confusing the thing he needed with the thing he wanted, because in his experience those 2 things in the same room made poor decisions together. He knew what this was. He was not going to do anything about it, because doing something about it would mean crossing a line that existed specifically to protect people in uneven situations from the weight of his interest in them, and Sable was, despite 6 weeks of small evidence to the contrary, still technically in an uneven situation. He reminded himself of this in the elevator on a Thursday morning, when he was on his way down to the lobby, for a reason that had nothing to do with the kitchen. He rode past the lobby level. He pressed kitchen. He had a brief and unsuccessful argument with himself between the 3rd floor and the basement. She was making bread. He could smell it from the hallway. She had both hands in the dough and her sleeves rolled up. And Marco was explaining something in his instructional voice, and she was nodding with the flour-dusted patience of someone who had already figured out what he was explaining, but was listening anyway because she understood the value of being taught. She looked up when he walked in. The expression that crossed her face before she arranged it into something more neutral was the most useful thing he had seen in weeks. "Morning," she said. "Morning." He crossed to the coffee station. "How's the service stock?" "Good," Marco said. "She made a court bouillon yesterday that I'm still thinking about." "That's not necessary information," Sable said. "It absolutely is," Marco said. "I'm going to write it down." Corbett poured his coffee and stood near the pass-through, because the pass-through was the part of the kitchen that was technically closest to the door, which made his presence there professionally defensible. Sable was watching him with the kind of sideways attention that people deploy when they want to observe without being observed, which worked better when the person being observed was not also very good at watching. "You could just ask," she said, without looking up from the dough. He blinked. "Ask what?" "Whatever the actual reason is you come down here in the morning." She folded the dough over with the heels of her hands. "Marco says you haven't used this kitchen before 6 a.m. in 4 years. Marco made a sound from the far stove that was not quite denial. Corbett set his cup down. He looked at the back of her head, at the flour on her sleeve, at the dough taking shape under her hands. He said, "I think you know what the reason is." She stopped. Her hands stilled on the dough. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. Marco discovered an urgent need to check something in the walk-in cooler, and disappeared with a discretion that Corbett made a private note to appreciate. Sable turned around. Her hands were still flour-covered. She looked at him the way she had looked at him in the pharmacy, the contract-reading look, careful and comprehensive and not willing to be wrong about this. "The situation here isn't even," she said. "I know you own the building I sleep in. I know. That makes anything you say." She stopped. Started again. "It's complicated. Yes, he did not move. He was very good at not moving when it mattered. I'm not asking you for anything. I want to be clear about that. I'm telling you something true because I think you're the kind of person who prefers true information, even when it's inconvenient." She studied him. And what if I don't know what to do with it? Then you don't do anything with it, he said. It doesn't change anything else. She held his gaze for a moment longer. Then she turned back to the bread. Her hands resumed their work, pressing and folding with that careful discipline of hers. Okay, she said. He picked up his coffee cup. Okay? I heard you. She didn't look up. I'm thinking about it. He left the kitchen. In the elevator on the way back up, he realized he was not thinking about the lease agreements waiting on his desk. He was thinking about the exact expression on her face before she turned back to the bread. He had been doing the wrong arithmetic for 6 weeks. He had been calculating exposure, complication, the distance between his world and hers, all the sensible reasons why this was exactly as complicated as she said it was. He had been adding those up and arriving at the only reasonable conclusion. The problem was that Sable Vance was not a reasonable conclusion. She was a woman who asked the right question at midnight in a pharmacy, wrapped leftover bread in a side towel, put him on 2 lists simultaneously, and said, I'm thinking about it the way someone says it when they mean I already know the answer, and I'm just making sure the ground is solid first. He had recognized that from the bus shelter. He had recognized himself in it. He went back to his office and sat down. The lease agreements were where he had left them. He looked at them for a moment, then he put them to the side. She knocked on his office door 3 days later. Not the kitchen, not the lobby. His office on the 4th floor, which required a key card she did not have, which meant Theron had let her up, which meant Theron had made an independent judgment call that Corbett had not sanctioned and would not correct. She was in her regular clothes, not kitchen clothes. The canvas bag was new, still secondhand, but the zipper worked. I thought about it, she said. He set down the pen he was holding. She came in and sat in the chair across the desk. The same chair as before, but differently this time. Less like a person who has arrived to make a request and more like a person who has arrived at a decision. The situation is still uneven, she said. Yes, I'm still in your building. You have a contract now, he said, with standard terms and a 30-day notice period that has nothing to do with anything else. Theron has the paperwork. She looked at him. You already did that 2 weeks ago. Something moved across her face. Because you were thinking about this 2 weeks ago. I've been thinking about it since the bus shelter, he said. I was doing the wrong math. She was quiet for a long moment. Rain moved across the window behind him. The harbor below was slate and silver, the mountains beginning to emerge through the cloud for the first time in weeks. I don't trust easily, she said. I know, and she gestured, a small motion that somehow contained everything. You're a lot. Yes, but you sat in the pharmacy and waited for your prescription and you said, come on, like it was the only reasonable option, and then you went home. She looked down at her hands, at the new-healed calluses from the kitchen work. You went home. You didn't make it anything else. No, she stopped. That matters to me, I know. She looked up. Her eyes were steady and brown, and exactly as careful as they had been in the pharmacy, which meant she had not stopped being careful, only decided that some things were worth the risk of being careful about. Okay, she said again. He felt something in his chest that had been doing a specific kind of arithmetic for 6 weeks come to a different answer than usual. Dinner, he said. Not here, somewhere with no connection to either of us. A restaurant on the east side, no one I know. Equal ground. She almost smiled. It was the second time he had seen that particular expression, and he was beginning to understand why it landed the way it did. It was not a cautious smile, it was a real one. The kind that had made its own decision about whether it was safe to exist. Equal ground, she said. Okay. He picked up his pen. He set it back down. He looked at her in the gray winter light that was slowly turning into spring. This woman with a broken zippered bag and careful eyes, who had asked a question at midnight that had turned out to be the most important thing anyone had said to him in years. And he thought very clearly, the way he only thought when he was certain, I am not going to be wrong about this. Outside, the clouds shifted. For the first time in weeks, the full line of the mountains appeared above the water, sharp and white and exactly where they had always been, waiting for the weather to clear.